Dr. Bradley, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. This question, he states, or she, that your focus on looking at the data reminds him of Thomas Sowell. The data only help if those in authority are willing to act in accordance with the findings. How do we overcome the challenges of data suppression to support today's false narratives?
That's a great question.
All right, very good.
Okay, what's the next one? I mean, I don't have an immediate answer on that, but that is part of the problem. I think that the pressure point right now is that things are getting so bad that it's forcing the conversation. There's a great book by Richard Reeves from the Brookings Institution on boys and men. And Brookings is sort of, how would you describe Brookings? Is it
center left?
It's center left. And so the center left is now beginning to discuss these issues. And Richard Reeves, it's interesting because Warren Farrell wrote a very similar book a few years ago, didn't get much press because Jordan Peterson picked it up and it kind of went right that way. But because Richard Reeves is at Brookings and has basically the same data, I'm not sure how the book got published because it doesn't have a lot of very, very new things in there, but it's a great book on boys and men, and it's forcing the conversation. I'm a bit encouraged because the data suppression is waning a bit, and it's not because those who want to suppress the data are winning. It's just that things are getting that bad. I mean, if you look at the suicide rate for men, young men and teens between the ages of 15 and 24, the number 2 cause of death for them is suicide. Number 1 is accidents. And so because of some of these trends, it's forcing the conversation.
I wonder if the data suppression is improving for all the wrong reasons. In other words, there was real data suppression, there was an agenda behind it, and that we're now at a point, well, maybe it's the right reason, but do you think it's desperation, that it's just gotten to a problem that is unignorable?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because things are really falling apart. And I was sort of tongue-in-cheek about the marriage issue, but that's a real issue. You have all these really competent women who want to marry up, because women do, and they should, and there's no one there. And then you add the sort of all the dating apps, it's a whole nother talk, right, where 20% of the men get all of the attention from women. And so you're sort of, because things are beginning to disintegrate, there is real desperation, which is making people pay attention to it as well.
Father, do you think that some of the sociological data that Dr. Bradley was going through, in terms of looking at cause and effect of what has created some of that phenomena, do you think it's too simple to say that some of this crisis with boys, the elements of fatherhood, is just merely a byproduct of a declining family? Or is that maybe simple but accurate enough? How would you almost pastorally see what has unfolded that has created this situation?
No, I think it's hard to underestimate how central that is, because everything begins in the home. Everything, our experience of God, our experience of money, our experience of relationships, what we learn about boundaries and sexuality and all the rest of it. I think it's hard to underestimate the impact of that. I don't know that it's simplistic at all. I think it's highly complex, the nuance of relationships and how that plays itself out, because you can have a father in a home, as you alluded to, and more can be said about that, but who is not connected to his children. And then the whole kind of counterpart of that, the role of women as well in the home, can be elaborated on as well. But I think that's the microcosm of the whole of society. So I think it's, utterly fundamental.
Dr. Bradley, you talked about a number of these elements that can be improved with stronger marriages, with building men up more. They're kind of bottom-up solutions in the church and the family. Do you see any role for the state or in public policy that addresses this sort of issue of fatherhood? There's a big movement on paid parental leave for fathers. It wasn't, I confess, as a business owner, and this can say about me what it says, I thought they were joking at first when some of my male employees were coming for paternal leave, and one person is asking, first of all, I'm asking broadly, is something like paternal leave helpful in this discussion? And if so, they're asking, would paternal leave other than a time of birth may be worth considering? I guess I'm using that to kind of invite you to talk more about the role of the state in some of these issues.
Yeah, that's a great question. I personally don't know if the states has the credibility to really lead on this, and I'm also cautious about thinking we need the state to lead on this. I think that within the context of those mediating institutions, we can really get at this locally without having to go to D.C. to get the Bishop of America, right, sort of in the White House to solve the problem for us. Now, in terms of things like leave, to me, it really makes sense if you're a business owner to make that decision without having the government force you to do it. So if you want to create your own paternity leave protocols and maternity leave, that's perfectly up to you because you're a business owner. You can do whatever you want. It's your business, right? And so we could encourage, and by the way, the data is pretty solid about the importance of that.
Of paternity leave.
Absolutely, yeah, yeah. Now, what's interesting, though, is when should the dad take it? Now, there are all sorts of, if you sort of look at developmental psychology, particularly for children, it might be better for the dad to take the leave when the kid's in middle school or high school, rather than, moms are like, yeah. It actually might be more effective those years than in the early years. In terms of children and attunement, the mom's role is so crucial. I mean, absolutely crucial. There's real data on this point that part of the baby's brain developing is in response to the dilation of the mom's pupils. Right? We have data. We have brain scans on this, right? So attunement with moms is really, really important early on. And I would encourage business owners to think about sort of long-term sustainability of their employees. If you want great employees, you want them to have great marriages, and you want them to have great kids. They're much less likely to need to take time off if the family's going well.
As we've seen from some of this data, a lot of the family problems are exacerbated by state interventions. The obvious example is the invitation of the man out of the home, so you have to have these facades. By the way, Catholic theology would say, although the practice isn't, but Catholic theology would say you can perform a marriage without a state license. Now, no bishops are going to give you that permission, but the fact is, and I think they need to go back to that, but you could have said, look, we'll get married, and you don't have to have the state recognition. But when you have all these incentives that are destroying the family, it's a little rich to go to those people and say, now, why don't you give us guidance on the family and the stability of the family?
So where would you fall in this issue? They used to talk about the marriage tax penalty, and do you think the state should have a tax code that punishes those who are married? Should it have a tax code that rewards those that are married? There's a number of ways this can be done with tax credits or the way rates are set marginally, or do you think the state should be neutral in tax code about a filing household?
I think the state should be minimal. So you just reduce, everything gets thrown on the schools and it gets thrown on the businesses. So now we have our health insurance and our retirement through the businesses, and it all gets thrown in there. What if you just radically reduce, I understand how politically unpalatable this is, but I don't care. I'm not a politician. The politicians have to work this out. But if you radically reduce the involvement of the state in all these things, both in terms of the tax policies, but also the regulations that mandate these things, when people go to a job and negotiate a contract, that's going to be part of the negotiation. You're going to have a whole process of discerning what do people really determine that they need for their families, and then let a business negotiate that with the thing and create a broad competition for businesses. I think it wouldn't take very long for there to emerge certain institutional best practices that would respond. And then you'd have the outliners of people who aren't involved or interested in any of that, and they could be also accommodated in their own markets. They'd have a certain comparative advantage in the same way that families, normal nuclear families would have.
It's interesting because you see that having played out in much of the, particularly big tech companies, a lot of companies that have young adult workers, where they sort of infantilize the workers. They let them skateboard around the office. They don't even have to come to work anymore, which is a whole new phenomena. But they offer them the incredible food and beverage and that whole WeWork model. They have kegs in the office and this stuff. And that didn't come from state coercion. That came from businesses organically deciding that that's how they're going to appeal to 25-year-old employees. And I don't know why the same model of spontaneous order and market competition couldn't create things that accommodate 45-year-old parents or 40-year-old parents the same way.
Yeah, well, how did that work out?
It hasn't worked out very well.
No.
Yeah.
They're also laying them off right now.
That's right.
That's right.
And I'll point out,
Because it went too far.
laying them off to no impact to the business whatsoever, no detectable impact to the business. Someone asked if, and they want all three of us to comment. I'll start with you, Father, then go to you, Dr. Bradley. Can you express the connection between liberty and responsibility? And I think this gets to the crux of the matter. Do you think people should be free to be unvirtuous? Should they be free to be irresponsible? How do we tackle that seeming paradox?
I give you the creation of the world. I give you the creation of the human family, that God leaves the decision for our salvation in our own hands. I prescind from the Calvinist debate on this, but we have to make choices, and there are limits to that, but I don't think every precept of the natural law needs to be implemented in civil law, but generally speaking, I'm sorry to say people have to be free to make mistakes. And very often people learn from their mistakes. Very often people die from their mistakes.
Anthony, do you want to add anything? Do you think that people should be free to be bad fathers? People should be free to be absentee fathers? Should they be
That
free
might be different, by the way, but go ahead. You
well, I
answer
think
it.
it
But
might
I just might want to qualify that. What I mean is free to make decisions for themselves. But when they have solemn contracts with people and
the
obligations.
state has an interest?
Well, I mean, it's just enforcing. Yes. By the way, this was a question I think David asked earlier about coercion, the role of coercion in society. Of course, unless you're an anarchist, you believe that not only should there be some mechanism of coercion, but even a monopoly of coercive power to enforce law. I'm not an anarchist. But the question is, what is that applied to? And it certainly should be applied to the obligation of a parent to support a child.
But as we're talking, and you mentioned Chappelle earlier, and he most certainly meant it as a joke, not doctrine. And yet,
Yeah, that was very.
You know where I'm going with this?
I know. I hope
we
you use
do
the
have
same
a
words he
society
used.
right now where people are free to be promiscuous. A woman is free to abort the child, but a man is not free to not support the child
Right.
financially.
Right.
And he meant it as a joke, I think, but it also sort of provocative.
No, I think he thinks about these things. I mean, I don't know the man, so I don't know.
Yeah, but Anthony, how would you interact with the tensions of free for promiscuity, parent responsibility, and wrapping these things together in both a civil and then a societal context?
I think today our definitions of freedom tend to be ideologically, right? So they're tribal. So you have one tribe's definition of freedom and sort of this culture war with another tribe's definition of freedom. And I think the problem is we're not talking about the sort of first questions, which is what does it mean to be human? And so what does it mean for a person to be free? This is something I learned from you 20 plus years ago. Free to do what they ought, right? That's what freedom really is. This freedom, this sort of liberty to do what it means, to do what it means for someone to do if they're actually made in the image and likeness of God. That's freedom. And what do we need to do in terms of structures and mechanisms to put people in a position where they're totally free to do what they ought to do? So things like slavery doesn't do that. Injustice won't do that. Ignorance won't do that. And so we have an interest in setting people free. This is the Exodus narrative. Setting them free to be what they could be, what they have the potential to be, because they are deeply and intrinsically made in the image and likeness of God. That is not libertinism to do whatever they want to do, but it's about virtue. And I think insofar as we have these mediating institutions that are also forming and shaping virtue, we don't have to rely on coercion from the state to put people in positions where they will exercise wisdom and virtue, because it's cultivated in all of these other aspects. I think I'm a Gen Xer. I'm nostalgic about the '80s. I think the '80s were absolutely fantastic for lots of reasons. The best music, hair, things like that, Duran Duran, et cetera. But I was probably, I have to look at this in terms of the data, but I may be of the last generation that had sort of Christians in the public school. And I was involved in a Boy Scout troop that had ex-military guys who were also Christians. And I was getting stuff at church, and I had my parents. So I was sort of getting formed in terms of virtue in multiple spaces. And I think we're relying on the schools right now because that just doesn't happen as much.
So speaking of that issue on schools, someone asked, and they're addressing it to anyone. I'll let one of you two or both comment about how do you protect the family when schools see more of kids than their parents do, and what do you do for those parents who could not go to a private or home school? And we'll just take off the table. One of the answers that I suspect all of us would give to some degree, in a policy framework, I'd advocate greater school choice. And Father and I are both close with the DeVos family, who have done a lot to seek out greater efforts for school choice. But with that option not fully there, and certainly some states are worse at it than others. We're sitting in one right now. Michigan's done some better things. Parents have limitations around school. The kids are at the school more than they're with the parents. We're advocating for the need for greater families to help instill these virtues. How do we resolve some of that tension?
Well, I think the response that begins with first asking the parents how important you think that is. How important? Is it the priority? Okay. Then homeschooling becomes an option. And with the technology today, that's easier than it's ever been before. And I don't say that it's easy, because, in my parish, those 68 students I mentioned, and now there are 400 students that began by inviting the growth. A lot of that growth took place because we had a lot of homeschooling families. And that means cooperatives, so that you don't lose the social interaction, the sports and all of that. And then what our school did, and does to this day, is a number of those students come just 2 or 3 days a week for classical enrichment programs so that they're taught in an institutional setting some things like Latin. All our kids take Latin, and sports and other kinds of things, or especially in high school, that the parents don't feel that they're quite up to doing. So I think we just need to be as creative, but you can't answer that question. Just say, homeschool your kids. And you say, are you crazy? Well, how important is it? How important is it to you? And it should be very important, especially now in this insane culture.
I'll just really quickly add, why is it that children spend more time with their parents, at school than with their parents? Maybe their parents are the problem, not the schools. So maybe the parents are too busy to spend the time with their kids versus the schools. So what if, this is crazy thought, what if parents decided to live below their means and be less busy to open up more space for that? Maybe their kids don't need to play 12 sports and learn 7 languages by the time they're 12. Right? We are extremely busy. What if we didn't worship the idol of success and trying to stack the 17-year-old's resume to create more space for that? So I wonder if on the lifestyle side there can be an adjustment made to slow down the pace of living and raising children in a country that makes, this is interesting about America, that the entire marketing industry is dedicated to making everybody feel inadequate. Right? Listen, if your dish detergent doesn't have the right kinds of oxidizing bubbles, right, your dishes won't get clean. And this idea that
they have not marketed well to me because I don't even have any idea what you're talking about. But
well, you don't do your own dishes. That's the
true.
problem. Yeah, you're right. But what if we didn't buy into this narrative that if our kids don't have absolutely impeccable, perfect resumes, that God won't advance them? I just brought Daniel chapters 1 to 6 in there, right? So I think living as Christians counterculturally might mean that we opt out of the busyness to create the space for connection to offset some of that time that's spent. Maybe also the parents need to be at the school. Awkward for kids, but, you know.
I also think that there's a sort of premise in the question that generally speaking is truthful, but if you get into the details, it needs a little better unpacking. That we have this sort of simplistic math that they're at school 7 hours a day, and then they're only at home with mom and dad an hour or 2 a day, if that. But and there's generally speaking some truth to that construct. But when you get into the weeds, they're not at school 7 hours a day. They're in science class for an hour a day, and they're with a different teacher another hour, and they're with their friends for a couple hours. And so there's a sort of diversification to the school life that I think alters the math of the way we weight these things.
Yeah, they're also in the car with their parents a lot.
Sure.
Right? Which is, by the way, a fantastic context for connection. Some of the best conversations that my students had with their parents were in the car.
Not just a chance to watch your daughter make a TikTok video.
Right. Especially road trips.
I was talking to myself there.
Right. The other part of this, too, is the seduction on the part of the schools. I said earlier that everything's being put on the schools and on businesses. So now it's breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner, aftercare things and all the sporting stuff, so that it draws away from that. When we began, I ended the hot lunch program in the federal hot lunch program in our school. I was asked, who's going to feed the kids? And I said, their parents. And what ended up happening was the mothers came, and they now make a hot lunch once a week, and then they have, other things. So.
Moving past that age group, I think we're mostly right now with the last couple questions talking K through 12. But when you talk about young people, meaning young adults, and I know Anthony has spent much of the last 14 years with college-age students. There's this stereotype about today's young people, meaning folks in their 20s, and their work ethic. And this question is, what are your thoughts on the work ethics of today's young people? Do we have a crisis of a poor work ethic amongst people in that kind of age group? I have some thoughts on it, but I want to ask Dr. Bradley first, your thoughts on the work ethics of our young adults.
It's not great, in part because so many of them have been coddled.
Yeah.
And so what's different between millennials and Gen Z, so by the way, millennials are parents of college students. Just want to make that clear. Millennials are the oldest millennials in their early 40s, right? So millennials aren't in college. Gen Z's in college, and the difference is that millennial parents were often known as helicopter parents. You know that term? They kind of hover over them to make sure things were taken care of. Gen Z, this sort of current college cohort down to middle school, they had snowplow parents. And the snowplow parent is the kind of parent who removes all of the obstacles in their way so the children never experience challenge or discomfort. And those children, when they go off to college, are an absolute disaster because they can't handle adversity. They also they can't self-regulate. Why is that? Because a parent was always there to regulate them. They didn't do free play. They never experienced boredom. They were addicted. They had a sort of a dopamine saturation constantly. And so when they don't have that, they actually don't have any agency, and they don't know how to direct their own lives. And so what they're used to having is an adult tell them what to do. And so when they enter into a work environment, and a lot of my friends who've hired this cohort will tell me, you know, they actually don't know how to take initiative. I have to tell them what to do. And then if I criticize them, they completely unravel. Because they don't know how to handle any sort of criticism about their imperfections. And the default is, I'm going to call my parents or I'm going to quit.
Yeah.
Right? Quick story. I rent out some spaces in New York City, and I had an ad up to rent a room. And I forgive me for my sin, but I was flabbergasted by the number of moms of mid-20-year-old grown men who were doing all the legwork for this rental. I couldn't believe it. And I told this, I was like, ma'am, I will talk about this with your son. I just can't do it. Right? So you have a lot of parents who were snow plowing their kids in their 20s, and then they're like, why are they still at home? Really?
Yeah.
Right? So it's not great.
Anthony, I'm afraid we're sounding like Statler and Hilton, you know. Kids these days.
Yeah, right.
We've gotten
No, it's the parents.
But
It's
no,
the
no,
parents
no, no,
these days.
yeah. But you know, I hate to refer to my school as though I'm just a booster for it, but the Italian restaurant had to do some catering for us, and the owners came in and said, by the way, we have 6 of the kids from your school working for us, and they are incredible. You tell them to do it once, they know how to do it, and if they're not clear, they come back. They have a great attitude. They like working. Now, why is that? It's not just the magic of that school. It's the whole formation of those parents who've come, and then that reinforces other families that might have been a little weaker in that regard. So what I'm saying is, other than just identifying, and I don't disagree with a single thing you said, because we've seen that as well, but I think we need to intentionally form communities that are reinforcing these kinds of values. It's not a lost cause. We can do it. But it requires, and have an intentional program here at the high school you may already have that, to do that and encourage that. Have a special semester that teaches how you change a tire. You know, we have a summer semester. Teach boys how to sew buttons on their coats. I mean, it's amazing, and things, just all practical stuff. In the summer we have we call it the Magdalene term, and it's a term that teaches these very practical things. How to sit at a dinner that's a formal dinner, a very formal dinner, those kinds of things.
Someone asked earlier about the wealth inequality, income inequality issue, and this topic is fascinating to me because we say we're so against this inequality, and yet what I've really learned as I've studied more and more, that when we talk about millennials or Gen Z, we're not talking about they're all lazy, they're all worthless, or they're all entitled. It's that the bottom 20% are real bad. And the top 20% are probably the most capable and productive and talented and meritocratic we've ever had. And then there is this kind of middle 60 that probably represents where the stereotype comes from. But you're creating greater inequality than ever because we coddle the bottom 20 and tell them it's okay to, at their work ethic and disciplines and habits. And meanwhile, the top 20 are not slowing down for anything. They're just incredible performers. And that is all taking place within one generation. It's not Gen Y versus Gen X. It's that within a generation, you're getting a bigger disparity. And I think that there's nuance in there that we're not fully unpacking.
Yeah, and the bar is really low. I mean, people wonder, I'm at the King's College, how is it that a little small Christian college in New York City was so successfully getting our graduates into Goldman Sachs and Bear Stearns and Harvard and Yale? Because they just do basic Christian stuff like say please and thank you and show up on time and things like that. The bar is so low that if you have basic Christian virtue, Daniel chapters 1-6, basic Christian godly virtues, you're going to go right at the top.
Well, the Christian virtues will be the question I leave Father Sirico. If you could give an answer, and after he answers, I'm going to let him go to catch his flight, and Dr. Browdy and I will stay for a couple more. But this question is how you define virtuous. We spent this whole day talking about free and virtuous society, and someone would like to know what we mean when we refer to virtues and the adjective of virtuous.
Well, that's an enormous topic and one worth really meditating on. I mean, I refer you to the classics in this regard. St. Thomas Aquinas gives a marvelous, I forget where that is in the Summa, but a marvelous definition of the virtues. But these, really there are some cardinal virtues that are highly theological, and they move us, they're the theological virtues. So virtues basically are not values. These words are used very interchangeably. Values are subjective things, they're norms, they're cultural, good, very often good cultural things. But virtues are objective. They have to do with the good, pointing toward the good. And what St. Thomas does is break them down in a way that helps people approach God. And so that's one of the things to remember about virtues. They're the inverse of the 7 deadly sins, right? And what you want to do, and here's what to remember with virtues. Virtues are to be aimed at, and the way in which you appropriate them, the way in which you take them into your life, is first of all by simple habitual repetition of the virtues. Amen. Right? What the habituation does is it's kind of like, it may be St. Thomas that has this illustration. If you want to get water into this area for what's the word I want? Irrigation. You can go up the mountain and get it out of the well and then come back down, or you can build something that just enables the water to come down. And that's what he says habits do. It just lets it flow naturally. So the more, any of you who are struggling with, let's say, habits of lust, could that happen in a Christian school? Well, we know the reality of what porn does. If you want to break that, you break it in small bits. You don't battle the dragon all at once. What you do is you begin to increase the virtue of chastity, but also any of the other virtues. Because all of the virtues will weaken all of the vices. They're all interconnected. And what you do is you just begin little by little by little, and you get this momentum going. And that's one very practical way. And you change, by the way, the very structure of your brain, because neurologically our brains are elastic. They can change, and a lot of the habituation occurs even physiologically, like muscle memory. Well, the brain is a muscle. And the other thing to do in terms of acquiring virtue is to look around you and see who a virtuous person is. Associate with them and imitate them. And when you do this over time, you become virtuous. I think we were talking last night about the great martyrs, for the most part, didn't decide to give their life to Christ when they were before the gallows. They did it every day. They died daily. And when that big moment came, it was much easier for them because they had appropriated all of these virtues. So I don't know if that touches on what the question was.
No, I think it does. I would love it if you guys wouldn't mind giving a very warm round for Father Sirico.
I want to say how encouraging it has been for me to come and see you all, to see your engagement. I mean, you may not know, but I can see you. And I know what it's like. I mean, I dread high school audiences because they're, and that's not what I saw today. It's a really encouragement. And I just want to say to you and the visionaries of this school, you're doing what you need to be doing. Do it more. Do it more. Be generous and do it more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Father. You did mention something, Dr. Bradley, about certain statistics that were showing causation and not just correlation, and they're wondering how that was established. So in other words, there's a trend where people will show correlative relationships, and yet in my business in particular, in investment management, we constantly say, well, correlation is not causation. But I think you explicitly stated that there was causation there, and how is that being connected?
Yeah, great question. So when you look at the data sets, and when you start controlling for certain variables, and you repeat the same study, and you do a meta-analysis of studies, and you start controlling for the same variable over and over and over and over and over again, the evidence is just so overwhelming that social scientists now are really left with the only conclusion about the causal mechanism, because the data. Now listen, this is stuff that I would say Christian communities have known for centuries, right? But it takes social scientists a while to validate the data once it presents itself in the exact same way, controlling for the father variable in multiple studies across time, across disciplines in education, in sociology, in psychology, et cetera. And so now social scientists are beginning to say this is causal. Yeah. That it's not simply a coincidence. A coincidence. It's not merely a correlation. That fathers really are that important.
So there's an empirical way of getting there by observation and process of elimination that would be considered scientific. If someone says, well, it's not falsifiable. So to the sense that, like, if someone bangs a hammer on the knee, I guess I can't prove the hammer is what hurt the knee, but it's almost that obvious.
It's beyond obvious at this point. And because some social scientists have attempted to explain it away, they failed. Again and again and again. Their explanations make no sense. Yeah. And so now they're just stuck with this data that they really have to interpret a certain way.
Yeah. Somebody had asked a question about where we should draw the line between pouring into a generation versus teaching them how to pour out and serve others. Rather than focus on their own independence and selfish growth, how do we, in other words, are we trying to teach people to flourish on their own, or teach them how to help others flourish? And I think I'm understanding where the question is going, but this sort of, in a way, brings up a topic that's very important to me. When I talk with people about my strong passions for a theology of vocation and work and calling, and people talk about the prioritization of family, and sometimes some will say, your work does not matter, family's all that matters, and I'll say, walk me through this. What am I trying to do as a family? You need to raise your kids to turn out well. And I say, does them turning out well have to do with their future work? And they go, yes, you want them to grow up and work and flourish and so forth. I'll say, but my work and flourishing doesn't matter. I'm trying to teach them to work and flourish. But then when they have kids, their work and flourishing shouldn't matter. Then they just got to teach their kids. And we get in this sort of vicious cycle where generation after generation, all that matters is the kids having the kids that have the kids, and no one along the way is ever stopping to succeed or achieve and produce. And of course, nobody really believes that, but they can argue in a way that sounds that way. And the reason is the false dilemma being presented. Should we teach them, should we pour into this generation for their growth and success, or should we teach them to pour into the future? The answer is yes. It's both and. That there is inherent value in the work we do now and in the value we do in instructing and nourishing and rearing, and then the same will be true for them. And this is, to me, first of all, part of my covenant theology and my belief that this is multi-generational instruction and obedience. But I do not believe that our sole calling is to teach somebody else about their soul calling so they can teach someone else about their soul calling with no one ever getting around to their soul calling. That there must be a both and between the instructive and multi-generational burdens and mandates and opportunities, and at the same time our present requirements for growth and so forth. And even the qualifier about rather than focus on their own independence and selfish growth. And I don't think Dr. Bradley meant it this way, but like you had talked about, people maybe have a little less of a lifestyle, but you're able to pour more into your kids, right? There's certain cost benefits analysis, there's trade-offs, and in every situation, some people's jobs are not, I can tick down the time 2 hours, and therefore there's a slightly less compensation in the family, but more time at home. Sometimes it is that easy, but other times, it's grayer and whatnot. I think every situation has to be evaluated with its own wisdom, own merits, but I still believe that Dr. Bradley and myself would advocate for the duality of responsibility, the duality of performance in the job and faithful child rearing and husbanding. Is there anything on that front you want to comment on?
Yeah, I would say that Jesus makes this really simple, that we love the Lord our God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love our neighbor as we love ourselves. So it actually is, it is the both and. What's interesting also is that we actually become less selfish in terms of our habits, our defaults, and experience an enormous amount of joy and happiness by committing our lives to the benefit of others. And if you're committing your life to the benefit of others, that has implications on vocation in terms of your job and career, but it also has implications with how you treat people. And we are happier when we are giving and loving and investing in other people. It's extraordinary. We actually get a pretty significant hit of dopamine and oxytocin by investing and caring for other people. It's amazing. It's amazing. I have a new book out on fraternities, college fraternities, called Heroic Fraternities. And what I'm telling fraternities is that what's it mean to be a man in a fraternity is to use your presence and your power and your strength and your creativity for the benefit of other people. And what might be surprising to people is that when I'm on a campus, a secular campus, and I give the pitch to do that, guys are like, sign me up. Because I think we have this intuitive sense that I actually become a better person by investing in other people. So it's not that it's selfish growth versus serving others. We actually grow by serving others.
A virtuous cycle.
Yeah.
is formed.
So Jesus says, love your neighbor as you love yourself. It actually feeds itself as we do both and.
And I would just add that even in our commercial endeavors, I believe it's important we understand markets well enough and understand free enterprise well enough to know that when you are earning more money and you are performing better in your job, and you can say, this is something I'm doing for myself, but then now I got to focus on the other things I do for others. In fact, you cannot succeed more in your job without serving others, because by nature of a market, the production of goods and services will only compensate you if you're meeting somebody else's needs. And so there is a sense in which going to work with the heart of serving others is very pro-market. That is, in fact, what a market ought to be. Now, that is attached to a virtue system, to a character trait, but my point being that we are not pitting market success versus serving others if we have properly ordered our vocabulary here. Okay, we'll wrap up with a couple questions here on the fatherhood stuff that a lot of people obviously were really taken by. First one is just a brief question, but I have a feeling there's something interesting behind it. Can fathers be forgiven? And I know the answer is going to be yes. Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. But how would you answer about the issue of fathers that have made grave mistakes and there's redemption?
Yeah, great question. So I recognize that when I do these sorts of things in churches, when you show the data, there's sometimes this realization of oops, and sometimes there can be a lot of shame that maybe I'm the cause of some of my children's struggles, and maybe it's too late. And I can tell you from having done this sort of ministry in this context for 20 plus years now, it's actually never too late. I have some friends. I did a men's retreat up in Sault Ste. Marie, Canada. You have to take guys way out in the woods to get them to open up sometimes. So it's taking way out in the woods, right? Way out in the woods. And these guys are crying about their dads and things like that, right? And they're sober, by the way. Yeah. And after the trip, these guys came back and they gave their dad one of the books that we recommended. The dad read the book, and one of the things the dad realized is that he didn't really play catch with them. That's what they really wanted when he was a kid, dad to play catch. And so these guys are in their 20s, dad's in his 50s. He shows up with a football, and they go outside and they play catch. And that was the beginning of them redeeming what had been lost. So it's never too late. I mean, the gospel itself makes that very, very clear. And so
It might be better for the dads too, because the 20-year-old kid might be better at catching the ball than the 6-year-old kid.
That's true. And so I just because of the way that the gospel lays this out, the way that the history of redemption lays this out from Genesis to Revelation, if you look at the history of God's people, God actually, we have to believe this, can redeem anything.
Yep.
Right? It's never too late. It's never too late. We have to create the conditions. I could say it this way: give God a chance to blow your minds, right? By leaning back into the discomfort and reestablishing connection.
Amen. Beauty for ashes. Somebody had asked a question, wondering, I think they're basically perhaps kind of second-guessing the thesis about teenage boys and their fathers, that their observation and even things that they've heard is that for the teenage boy, they respond better with their mothers. You seem to be suggesting different. Speak to that particular uniqueness of the age of a teen boy and that dynamic with their mom and their dad. Obviously, there's nothing you said that suggests the relationship with the mother is not important, necessary, but there's a unique element to the father that maybe is countercultural in your message.
Absolutely. And I have about a 90-minute podcast where I just cover the data just on that. Because the data shows that boys they really need their dads between the ages of like 12 and 25. And that when they don't have the guidance of their fathers in their lives during those years, they pretty much unravel. In fact, they not only need their dads, they also need another mentor. And I have a book on that. That what an adolescent boy needs is his father and someone else who is around his father's age, not a 22-year-old youth pastor, but someone who has some wisdom to help also be a coach. And when you have the sort of tag team of the dad and in some traditions, we call them godfathers. In the Eastern tradition, it's spiritual formation. That tag team of the dad and the mentor really sets them up for success. And why is that? Why is that? Because the adolescent brain is asking, do I have what it takes to be a real man? And there's something unique about the father's voice speaking into that question that changes the lad's life. If you think about it this way, I may have mentioned this last night. Oh, I did actually. So Jesus himself needed to hear from his Father. He heard from his Father at his baptism. This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. He knew that his mother loved him. Joseph by now is out of the picture. But he needed to heard from his Father. This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased. And the very next thing that happens is Jesus goes into the desert to do battle with Satan. And what boys need is to hear their father's voice to tell them, I love you and I believe in you. And when boys hear that, they're almost unstoppable. And I've been in this space for almost 25 years. And I see it over and over and over again when a father validates his son and affirms his son and celebrates his son, the son just comes alive. And it's not that a mother's love and a mother's affirmation doesn't do that. But when the father does it, it's just different. It hits the boy differently.
What's so interesting, just biographically, I lost my dad when he was 21, and we were very close, and he was my hero. And I've done a lot of things in my life professionally, and my dad hasn't been here to say anything. But I often get letters from people that will say, "Your dad would be so proud." And other times I get letters from people saying, "Wow, I'm really impressed," or "You've really done great things," whatever. But when they say my dad would be proud, it means more to me than when they say they're impressed or something. And it's both complimentary and appreciated, obviously. But even people who didn't know my dad telling me my dad would be proud still carries that certain significance. I think that reinforces what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I've been on men's retreats with grown men who were in their mid-40s, early 50s in tears because they've never heard their father say, "I'm proud of you." No. Right? In tears. The guy's a CEO. And he's in tears because he's never heard his dad say, "I believe in you. I am proud of you." Knows his mom does it, right? But when the father says it, it just opens up his heart. So dads have a real opportunity. So the subtitle of my book is How College Men Can Save Universities and America. Because as I mentioned on the work ethic issue, there is some problems with this generation, but I genuinely believe that if we can raise a generation of virtuous young men who know they're loved, no matter what they're loved, they're cared for, they're inspired, they're affirmed, they're validated, they're celebrated, they're respected, it's going to change the country. Yes. And it is schools like this one that is situated on the front lines of doing just that. And we need more institutions and opportunities to form them. So I'm enlisting everyone to come on this heroic journey to inspire a generation of young men to love their neighbors with reckless abandon.
You inspire that generation of young men with reckless abandon, you will get your free and virtuous society. Thank you very much.